Pause and welcome everyone. For all our American friends, happy Thanksgiving. And I'm going to keep this very short because I know everyone is here for Liz. So, very happy to have Liz here. Wonderful friend, wonderful, bright mind to pick and to listen to. So, but also bring your ideas. Let's do what we do. We chat, we talk, we go back and forth. So let's keep it to our spirit and let's bring Liz in our group. Welcome, Liz.
Hey, good to be here. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? Anyone guess? Anyone know me well enough to guess? Right, I'm not going to talk too much about Cynefin because I know you already heard some stuff from Jürgen last time about complexity thinking, and I think most of you already know this. The thing that I want to talk about today is actually mostly constraints. So I'm going to talk about constraints. I'm going to talk a little bit about Wardley mapping. I'm going to talk about fitness landscapes and disposition and why everything is correlated in retrospect. Okay, so constraints. So just a very quick overview in case there's people on this call who don't know Cynefin. There are 5 domains. You'll see that I'm using the new language. So the first domain is clear. That means it's really clear. It's really obvious what's going on. I go to landlady in the pub. I go, what do you do when the beer runs out? She says, well, I changed the barrel. Duh. Right. So really easy problems to solve. Complicated problems require expertise, but they still have a predictable outcome. So you can close the gap. You can analyze them. Complex problems correlated in retrospect. You can see with hindsight how things emerge. So they're not predictable, but they're not urgent. You can make things safe to fail. We call trying out things which are safe to fail probe. In chaos is accident and emergency. It's your house burning down. It's completely unpredictable. You have to act and act really quickly. It's dominated by urgency. It is also the domain of urgent opportunity, but it's normally regarded as a really bad place to be. And we don't like uncertainty as human beings. We're not good at handling it, primarily because we associate it with chaos. That gives us a problem dealing with complexity as well, because we keep trying to make things predictable. And you can see this all the time in organizations when they come up with their big upfront waterfally plans, etc. It's what we call disorder. It's now called confusion. So disorder confusion is the one in the middle, right? And that's basically the state where we don't know which of these dominates, so we behave according to our preferred domains. So you often see people treating stuff which is emergent as if it can be made predictable. All right. So complex as if it's complicated. You can get it the other way around. So I've got into trouble for not reading the instructions on something which wasn't safe to fail, but I see it much more commonly the other way. All right, so that's Cynefin. You'll see there's also some stuff associated with each of the names of these domains. There's some constraints associated with it. That's what I really want to talk about today. So that clear domain has fixed constraints. That's kind of like a plug. Right, it's only one way to put something into a wall, and it's intended that you can't really get it wrong. The complicated domain has what we call governing constraints. I've got them in the wrong order, never mind. So chaos has no effective constraint. Okay, chaos fire will burn until it reaches constraints. It's what makes it chaotic. Governing constraints, they're what we call context free. That means they apply regardless of context. So you can think of machines that are dominated by physics and by the interlocking of cogs and things like that. They can't really escape them. But also hard and fast rules. Okay, so you can think of GDPR in the UK, you know, privacy rules. That's a governing constraint. The fines for getting it wrong are absolutely huge. Enabling constraints, though, they're contextual, so they're more like guidelines or heuristics. You're meant to follow them, but you can escape if you need to. So Dave Snowden, when he talks about this, he uses the concept of a seawall versus a salt marsh. So when a seawall contains, it's rigid, right? It's robust, but when it breaks catastrophically. A salt marsh absorbs the sea as it comes in, so you get a little bit of warning, right? So when it breaks gradually. It gives you a little bit of warning. I always think of the overflow in a sink, right? But if my cup breaks, the water goes everywhere. If I overflow my cup, the water goes everywhere. But a sink has a little bit of an overflow in, so it gives you a little bit of time to react to the fact that it's filling up. Okay, and of course it's a continuum with the phase shift in the middle, so things can be more governing, more enabling, etc. Okay, so that's how the constraints work in Cynefin. So one of the ways I use this is when I go into organizations, I look to see, can I see chaos? Can I see people thrashing around, arguing over things? You know, do they not know what's going on? Because then sometimes putting some constraints around it can help to dampen the chaos down. You know, if you've got production bugs left, right, and the center, suggesting TDD, BDD, stuff like that can actually help to constrain the fire. On the other hand, if I see that nobody can get any work done because the governing constraints are so strict, you know, there's the typical one is there's some CAB process that everybody has to go through and it takes 2 weeks and it's a pain in the neck. And go, can we make a hole in it? Can we make it permeable in some way? Can we make it less rigid? So you might say things like, well, could we get away with not doing the CAB process if it was just a very small bug? Could we get away with not doing the CAB process if we're releasing just 2 weeks worth of work and we haven't had a significant issue in the last 6 months? Can we get a shorter CAB process? Can we get a lighter CAB? Like, that's the kind of thing we look for. So can we loosen up those constraints in some way? Right. And it's really fun when you start looking at things as an ecosystem of constraints and you ask what constraints are acting to cause these problems. And instead of trying to reach some goal, so lots of places they want to go agile, they want to be at that place. Instead of trying to just impose agility, we look at what constraints exist, which ones of those can we change, and where we change them, where can we actually see whether that change is helping or not. So I'm looking at everything is just a ton of probes and a ton of interventions probes where you're changing constraints, and everything is constraints, legacy systems, culture, promises that the already been made to the business, right? You start looking at relationships, investments of social capital, time, actual money capital, you know, all of these form the constraints. So you ask which ones of these can we change? And as you unpick the constraints, so it changes the disposition, and maybe the constraints which are harder to change are now easier to change. And that's how you start getting change working and snowballing. There you go. So that's the constraints. So I'm going to stop sharing just so that you can talk about that a little bit. I've got a couple of other pictures and I'll talk a little bit about Wardley mapping and fitness landscapes, but does anyone have anything they want to talk about that? Any questions? Any thoughts? If you're all being really quiet, I'm just going to go straight and start talking about fitness landscapes and then Wardley mapping.
When you're working with these constraints, sorry, George, you were holding up your hand. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You started.
When you're working with those constraints, you still stay in the same domain which you were. You stay in the complicated domain even when you are loosening up that cap, or are you also trying to move there?
So I might be trying to move the treatment of something as which is complex. Somebody's treating it as if it's complicated. So the CAB process assumes that there's a level of predictability and things aren't going to change faster than 2 weeks, right? So something is being treated as complicated. The thing is, innovation is complex. It's full of discovery. You get emergence, right? So if you want innovation, you can't put complicated processes over the top of it. I mean, obviously there might be some like GDPR, but you're probably not going to meet GDPR regulations in an innovative way, unless you're like Apple and hugely into privacy and totally overkill on it. Your innovation is probably going to be somewhere else. But that innovation is always going to be emergent. And so you need to have processes which allow you to react to those discoveries. And they've got to be enabling as a result.
So George first and then Hanan.
So I don't want to get us too far off track, but I'd just like to throw in a little wrinkle that a lot of which domain you're in depends on how you see the problem. And that's something I notice a lot of times. People get fixed on seeing a problem in a particular way, and so they think it's clear. But if you zoom out, then you start to say, oh, well, there are all these other pieces that I'm not taking into account. And you zoom out again, and there are people involved. And my feeling is as soon as you get people involved, you're in complex at least. And so zooming in and out and looking, examining this through all of these different lenses, you probably will find ways of looking at the situation in front of you that fit all of them. And then you get to choose what are the bounds of the system you're going to try to work with.
Yeah, because you can work with constraints at different levels. What I will say is if you have no access to expertise, you have to treat it as complex. And all software efforts have a complex problem because we're always trying to do something new. We're not trying to do the same thing we were doing before, unless, and I'll talk about this a little bit with Wardley Mapping, we're trying to stabilize something. But stabilizing something for the first time, automating something which was manual, for instance, is complex. So
hi, so let me get that straight. So when you introduced this framework, I thought it was like physics. Like the first time you saw things, it's like that's my background. What was my background? Anyway, so when the first thing that when you look at the new problem, you look at it like it's very chaotic. You don't know where to start, and then when you start taking the time to understand different components, then you go into a complicated version of that problem. And then more you go into that journey, you go into the complicated one. So then you start doing some probing and you start understanding a little bit. And with experience, it becomes obvious. Is this what is this framework is trying to teach us?
It's so the dynamics go both ways. There's I wonder if I've actually got something I can show you here. Let me just very quickly look up my dynamics. I've got them somewhere. Because it's worth having a look at those. Cynefin for mappers. I must have shown this at Map Camp sometime. Yeah, look at this. Dynamics. All right. Sharing my screen. I love that I've got 15 talks on this and I can just reach for any of them. All right, so this is one of the main dynamics. I call it the innovation cycle. Ignore that for the moment. So the idea is you start with something that is relatively unknown. So cameras on phones. The people who got these working first, they were people like Kyocera and Sharp, and they put the camera in landscape mode, pointing towards the user because they thought people would do video calls with it, right? And what happened was Nokia realized that that wasn't the thing to do, put it on the back so you could take photos, put a little mirror so you could take selfies. Now it's a really well understood problem. So it's just complicated. And we've all got one on the front and one on the back. And because of that, you can now build on it. So you get things like Pokemon Go, which is quite innovative. So you get these cycles of things becoming well understood, but then something complex gets built, comes understood, something complex gets built. And you see this with Wardley Mapping as well. There's a little thing called the shallow dive into chaos where you separate people to come up with ideas. I'm not going to go into too much detail over it. You've probably all done retrospectives where you brainstorm things as individuals on post-its before you bring them together. It's that kind of thing. So separating people so they can't talk to each other, they're all disconnected. That's also a kind of chaos. It's shallow because you know when you're going to come out of it. Very small percentage of things become obvious. Not that many. Right, if any of you have heard of Lean Six Sigma stuff that minimizes variance, that's the place to do it. You want screws, resistors, things to have very limited variance because they're just commoditized and you use them everywhere. They've just got to work. But you definitely don't want to be applying those techniques of limiting variance over in the complex space because you'll stifle all your innovation. There's all kinds of news articles on what happened when the Six Sigma people try to come into a software department. It's just completely inappropriate. There's a lovely one called chaos grazing. And this is what I think startups do. Though apparently they've started seeing it in larger places because of the pressure. So it's something that also happens when you get pressure on. Startups do it because they're running out of money, right? So they've got this sense of urgency. So they come up with a novel idea, because chaos generates novel ideas because you've got nothing to lose. Try it out, so now they're trying something, and stabilize it just enough to move on to the next idea. And they're always doing this thing. And what happens in startups is they'll come across a product that works. Oh my God, this works, brilliant. Now we need to get it out, we need to scale it, we need to grow. And you start seeing that the company grows. They get to around about 50 to 70 people, sometimes smaller, sometimes bigger, but at some point, they should be in the innovation cycle, but they can't because they made such a mess of their code base because they didn't stabilize it enough. Right? And you see this all the time. And it's because of this sense of urgency, because you don't have time to make the code beautiful. Geoffrey Moore talks about this in Escape Velocity. He's the guy who came up with Crossing the Chasm. He says Horizon 3 is your R&D, so it's complex. Horizon 2 is your stabilizing that R&D, and Horizon 1 is the stuff that's in production making you money. And Horizon 2, that act of stabilizing things, fights for budget with Horizon 1, which is why we always end up getting tech debt. So you have to actually, if you're going to get that really new thing into production, you actually have to spend the time stabilizing it and make sure there's money available to do that, because you will have a mess when you first start and you will need to spend time getting it production ready. There's all kinds of anti-patterns of things that happen when people don't invest in their good engineering practices, and it is loss leading, it's expensive, right? But that's how you cross the chasm, because the early innovators and adopters, early adopters, we don't care if things are buggy. We've got a need and we'll help you put it into context. We'll help you tweak it until it's understood. But the people on the other side of the chasm, the late adopters, the early majority, they don't want to have to tweak things. They want it to just work, and it's got to be bug free by then. And this is expensive. That movement from the chaos grazing to this innovation cycle, that's expensive. So it's probably time to show you Wardley maps.
Yeah.
Shout out, because I can't see everybody's faces, but shout out if you've got any questions. Ardita, if you can.
Yeah, Rian, did you have your question answered? You had your hand earlier, but I guess he got his answers. So
cool.
Yeah.
Okay, shout if you want anything. All right, so let's talk about Wardley maps. Let me just find my other one with the Wardley map. Boom, 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 boom. Here we go. All right. So share the screen. It's going to be that one. All right, so Wardley maps. Okay, so now you know Cynefin, you can probably see how it applies to Wardley maps, right? We've got the complex stuff over on this side. Sorry, I'm trying to do it facing you. So over on the Genesis custom built side, it's complex, and then it gets more and more mature and more certain. But as I said, the movements of things are always complex as well. So things stabilize, they move to the right. And they become less and less complex, but there's always new stuff coming in. And sometimes people do something new with something, they'll repurpose something. So exaptation is that repurposing of things for something innovative and new, and it'll move the other way, okay? Between each of these areas, these dotted lines, is inertia. That black bar is inertia. It's really hard to get through inertia, right? This is the chasm. And I did at Map Camp, I had to do a talk on are maps bad, and I said, well, they're bad if they're misrepresenting reality, and that dotted line is not a good representation of reality, right? So I actually drew I'm going to skip through this so you can see the drawing I made of the Wardley map. Okay, so this is the same thing with Genesis, custom build, product, commodity, but it accurately represents the inertia, the problems that you encounter between each of those phases. You've got here be dragons and the mountains of madness in this yawning chasm of doom, right, that you're going to fall in. And what I said at Map Camp was inertia is the quest. Learning how to get through this, how to get your scatty little prototype into something that's stable, that works, that meets more needs. That's the quest. And it's how you work with that. So going back to the Wardley map. So the idea is really simple. You've got visibility to customers, and you can map your whole architecture. I've seen people do this with skills, so the skills available to a development team and how mature they are. There's all kinds of things that I've seen people map. I've seen people do this with Post-its. I've seen people do this with PowerPoint. I've seen them do it with Miro whiteboards. I've seen them do it just with Excel, like just writing things in boxes in an Excel spreadsheet. So there's all kinds of ways to do this. The conversations are the most important part. One of the other things that I find really interesting is if you can get people to do this without the template, so just visibility versus maturity, work out where they sit relative to each other, and then put the boundaries in afterwards. And the conversations that happen are slightly different. And you're going, okay, well, is this a product? It's not, it's something we're building, but it should be a product. We shouldn't be building this because it's not differentiating. We should just be buying it off the shelf. And people start seeing where they've been in disorder, in confusion, right? Where they've been treating things as innovative, where actually you should have just bought it because it's not differentiating, or they're buying something to do something that actually this is new, and of course we can't do it with this product because this product doesn't do what we need it to. Nobody's ever done it before, and nobody's done it within our context. So you can have really great conversations that result from this. I was talking to one of my clients, just mapping all the things which were moving and the things which they had to move to get their differentiator working. It turned out there were actually a ton of other things which were also experiments, also, new. There were about 5 of these things that they were building in this pyramid of uncertainty. So they've worked out that probably getting some help on some of those and partnering up with people, buying things instead of trying to make them themselves, because they're developers, and developers really love custom building things when they don't need to. There you go. So that's Wardley mapping. Again, any thoughts, any questions? I'm going to stop sharing it because I'm pretty sure it's all in your head, so you can go look this stuff up.
So I hope everyone can hear me right, and the noise of the cooking isn't too loud. All right. No, I really felt the comment about developers love to customize things. I'm currently in a situation where we're in a startup where we started out before the commodities, as you call them, the frameworks were there. And now the frameworks are there, and because many more people are working on those frameworks, they've overtaken our own internal frameworks in quality. And now we're trying to looking to get rid of them, but because they are ingrained everywhere, it is in fact very hard to get rid of them. And that's something that, that makes sense. But it seems to me that I don't know where this problem sits in the I don't know where this problem either sits. I can figure out where it sits in the Wardley map, but I can't figure out where it sits in the complexity domain.
So Wardley Maps doesn't have chaos, I think, unless you count like genesis of novel ideas. They might come from chaos. The complex stuff, this idea you're custom building something, so it's innovative, it's something new, right? So people creating new BDD tools. Back when we did it, really early days, nobody had anything quite like it, right? And actually, JBehave 1 is a really great example. JBehave 1, it was you had to write Java classes, and you would name the Java class in Camel Case, and it would output a sentence in English from that. And it did a ton of other stuff as well. And it was a bit heavyweight. And what we found was it was a little bit slow, a little bit kludgy. Not too many people used it. Meanwhile, somebody was porting it. So Dan North was porting it to Ruby. So it became RBehave, which became our spec story runner, and David Glimpsky got hold of it. And of course, Ruby works with strings. So he made it work with strings. And he's like, well, if it's going to work with strings, it can work with plain text. So now we're inputting, we can use plain text as our input. Bingo, now we've got Gherkin. We threw away JBehave 1. There was a lot of work went into it. We threw away every single line of code and rewrote it from scratch, right, for JBehave 2, because the way Cucumber did it was just better. And we basically ported what's now Cucumber into Java. So that willingness to throw things away is really hard, because you invested in something and you did it because there was nothing like it. And now this thing you've invested in, along comes another product that does it so much better. And Simon Wardley talks about this. This is the inertia, right? You've invested in this thing, and it's really hard to say that thing we invested in is worthless. It did its job. Now there's something better. Go get the better thing. You know, it's really hard. It's even harder when you're in an organization that moves super, super slowly, and you've not been given access to their server, and you've got to develop something. So you introduce Mercurial, because Git wasn't a thing back then, and then they have a massive go at you for introducing this new thing, because it took them 6 months to get people to agree on Subversion. You know, it just moves so slowly, and it's because of the constraints. That's why it's moving slowly, because all these governing constraints everywhere, hard and fast rules everywhere. So one of the things I really like doing is introduce standards, because it helps to absorb the chaos, but don't insist on them. If somebody really wants to try a new technology, you have to let them. Otherwise, you don't get the innovation. Right? So we have preferred frameworks, preferred languages, preferred ways of coding Java. But if you don't allow people to go, this line is an exception in their check style when they submit it to the build, you'll run into trouble. So you've got to allow those exceptional cases if you want innovation.
There are some questions going on about, did documentation help with throwing away? Did some features lost from version 1 to version 2 produce blowback?
No, the features we eliminated were originally a replacement for JUnit. JUnit 3, you had to start every method with the word test. JUnit 4, you could just use test annotation. It was fine, it was better, so we got rid of that. There was a Swing UI framework that should never have been in JBehave anyway. I extracted that out into its own library. You can see it on my GitHub. What else did we get rid of? Mocking framework, it had its own mocking framework. Mockito came along, that was much better. So actually there were a ton of little products with single responsibilities that did the job that everything in JBehave did so much better. So yeah, we got rid of a ton of features, like, and just focus on that end-to-end story level, you know, scenario level, system level scenarios. So yeah, no blowback whatsoever. But the act of doing it did inform a lot of this stuff, you know. So Mockito got created. I was at the Guardian with Shepan Faber, and he saw me rolling out my own mocks rather than using a mocking framework, because trying to do BDD with the give and when then, with the mocking frameworks at the time, it was like given, expect this to happen, when, then go back and verify the thing that's further up, and it just wasn't reading nicely. And rolling out my own mocks allowed it to, you know, my own little stubby classes allowed me to make it read better. And Stepan has these huge hands. He was banging on the table going, this shouldn't be working this way. It should be easier than this. And he went off and wrote Mockito over the weekend, you know. So sometimes this is what I mean about these things are an ecosystem, and when you remove one constraint, suddenly a whole load of other things make sense and start moving too. And this is how you get these enabling technologies and innovation, big loads of innovation all start happening. I think we're about to hit another one of those thresholds actually. Dave Snowden's been posting things about apex predator theory. There's this really lovely thing that happens when the investment in a wave starts topping out and you start seeing the laggards taking hold of it. So the big banks are now doing Agile, so McKinsey and Accenture, right? So the big consultancies have got hold of it, the big banks are doing it, and people are starting to really push solutions. And that means it's about to start going, like, there's no point being Agile anymore. And we're post-Agile. Everybody does it to some degree. What's the next thing? And we're hoping that the Cynefin-based change will be the next wave, because there's some really fun stuff in that. Really, so, like,
are you saying beyond... Agile is becoming a commodity?
Yeah. So really fun things. That repurposing of stuff, the exaptation I talked about, that's really innovative, and it means not meeting your customer's need, which we talk about a lot in Agile, but working out who else your customer could be. That's not something we do in Agile, but the Cynefin stuff does that. Right? All the Cynefin based innovation that's coming out, that does that. It's really exciting. Really, I'm so excited for the next generation of software methods that are coming.
Yeah. Is that something, Paul, you were talking about, innovation, the mother of necessity? And do we know the problem that people need?
I think I was just making an observation based on the example that Liz used about, going from JBehave to the evolution back to throwing away where we started. So JBehave was solving a problem, but wasn't necessarily the right one. And sort of like the build, measure, learn cycle that I love to implement from Eric Ries and Lean Startup. It really questions the value of the prototypes that I create or I help teams create, which is this might have solved an initial idea, but it doesn't mean it's the long-term right one. And how do we get there? And the courage and strength to throw away that initial prototype and continue to build and innovate on it it's really a sign of a powerful team and a mature team, right? But it's hard to get people to really let go of that initial idea, right? But I love that story. So it was more of a comment and observation that I was just making those connections for myself.
Liz, there are two last questions on chat. I don't know which one do you want to take based on what you have in mind. One is about connecting now Wardley Maps with Cynefin, and the other one is Alistair is asking, what would you do better or different with Wardley Maps?
Would I go through distance data and create more or swarming sessions to find new services or products or resolve complex problems? So the session I just did with a client, because they were moving so many things to the right to try and they were trying to stabilize a lot of stuff so they could build on it. I asked them, are you going to make those things you're stabilizing into products? Are you actually going to sell them? And they've realized that there's actually some value even in selling those, let alone the end thing they're trying to build on them. There might be some value actually in selling those. So yeah, you can identify not just services and products, but also where you need a service or product that doesn't exist and you don't want to build it yourselves. So one of the things that Simon says is open source it. Start it and then get other people to help you. And everybody benefits and you get to build the thing you really want.
Is that the community idea? Create a community around it?
Yep, you can create a community around it. People will contribute if it's valuable. Google do it all the time. Yeah.
Anything you can do different?
Anything I do better or differently now that I've added Wardley Maps in addition to Cynefin? Recognizing that the movement is complex. recognizing that that movement is complex and having that. So one of the interesting things that I've done with Cynefin in the past, and Dave sometimes talks about this, is when you're looking at problems, rather than putting them in the corners, try just putting them in a line with the amount of certainty you have, how predictable are these problems to resolve, right? And then you put boundaries in. So it's just a straight line version of Cynefin. That's kind of the same as Wardley maps, except you've got the connections. So seeing architecture as systems, seeing that some systems are more complex than others, some systems are more mature than others, and recognizing the constraints that those then impose. Because a lot of the problem that I come across is people can't become agile because of the connections to legacy systems, right? They can't, those are the constraints. So when you start being able to free up those constraints, you put interfaces in place that mean you can ship independently of changes to that legacy system, right? That legacy system that you can only ship to once every 2 months doesn't stop you from shipping stuff you need to in your new online thing, right? It's those kind of changes that I'm able to visualize, help people talk through with Wardley maps. So that, I mean, they run workshops together. The two of them are so similar that Dave and Simon are now running workshops together and masterclasses together, because when they saw how much overlap there was, it was just like, wow, that's intense. So
Ayaz, do you want to talk about yours, or should we just go from what you wrote there about large organizations taking the chaos grazing approach?
Mathias, do you want to talk about it at all?
Yeah, you're on mute.
I saw her own. Your hand went up at some point. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Oh,
sorry.
But Matthias, go ahead. My question was answered in your later talk.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I when you talked about chaos grazing, it reminds me actually, I mean, when you're talking about Agile, sort of like everybody's doing it, I sort of feel like a lot of large organizations are doing what you just described earlier with the chaos grazing, right? They dip into it, they try it out as a novel thing, they create a little bubble, they maybe check the box, yes, we have Agile success, but they never take the investment, the huge investment to change all the bureaucratic structures, all of those constraints, everything that's outside of the little Agile bubble that they created, and stabilize it as something that is actually becomes a sustainable part of the mindset, where you don't impose predictability from the outside on that little bubble that you've created. So it's both true that you're saying it's becoming commoditized, but what's becoming commoditized is sort of bad or incomplete Agile or whatever you want to call it. It's like the name is becoming commoditized, but not the actual thing. Do you have any thoughts on how do you get companies who started this but never actually completed it and are now trying to move on to the next thing with all that process debt or mindset debt or whatever you want to call it?
So Jim Shaw and Diana Larson have this thing called the Agile Fluency Model that I really love. And it describes a pretty typical journey. So I'll talk about the zones in my language, but it's worth reading. There's a post that one of them did on Martin Fowler's blog on it, and they've renamed some stuff. There's some new stuff that's coming out, but they've got 4 zones. So they say the first zone, it's like you've just adopted Scrum, so but you're an enterprise, so you're able to demo every couple of weeks ish, and it takes you a while to get the demos right and to learn to get feedback and change direction. And what do you do with that big thing of documents that you needed to get the budget in the first place, because the budgets haven't shifted yet, so you had to do some analysis anyway. That's welcome to the ecosystem of constraints, but you can change direction now and get feedback, and you're more likely to, when you do release, to have something valuable. So there is value even in just doing that. And then the second zone is DevOps, right? And I always think of this as like a trust thing. So IT's trust with the business is totally broken in most of these places, but IT come to trust development, and they're like, oh, okay, now you've got something, can we get that? Can we get that shipped? And now you've got to ship it. So now you've got to talk to IT ops. and you get DevOps working, and you start getting operations on site, because you're able to produce things that the business now really want really urgently. So it starts putting pressure on IT ops to change too. So you get these DevOps pipelines in place. Now you can start shipping, and they call it release at will. So now you can release at will. And it's only once you start being able to release tiny things that the business go, well, hold on, could you try this out for us? And you get pushback from IT that go, well, look, that's actually really tricky, but we could do this because we understand the problem you're trying to solve. Well, does this look right? And you start actually seeing partnership, and IT is no longer a service center. That takes years. And when you ask people what going agile looks like, that's what they mean. That's at level 3, right? Zone 4, they said, is a bit of a red herring because it's being able to respond to market opportunities. So that urgent opportunity, they said even Spotify went into zone 4 and then came back to zone 3 again, right? And I can see why, because it's chaos, and chaos is transient. The opportunity goes away. You're there while you're the head of the market. You're doing this new innovative thing, but somebody, Nokia, is going to come along behind you, right? And it'll damp back down again. So you're not going to be in that zone 4 for very long. I think it's one of those things where you get yourself to a place where you can respond to the opportunity, and then you fall back again. So that agile fluency model is really, really nice. Yeah, so he's put the link in the chat.
Yeah,
I really like that. I wanted to very quickly talk about fitness landscapes, and I know we've only got kind of 10 minutes. Can I do that very quickly in the last little bit? Just talk about disposition, how you get through this inertia. Okay, so I'm going to share my slide deck again. Let me just find the fitness landscape. There we go. Sharing screen. Right. So Cognitive Edge, Dave's Flanders company, have this lovely thing called SenseMaker, and they do these surveys with it. So they ask, tell us a story about your work. And in your story, what matters was, this was taken from one of their culture things, I think, showing initiative, understanding context, or applying good practices. And you move the counter to where you think it belongs. So it's relative. And they found that the ambiguity, because you have to think about it, you get more ambiguity than you ever would with a scale of 0 to 10 where everybody votes 7, right? So you can start seeing patterns. So they did this with Singapore. They said, tell us a story about your life in Singapore. They said past, present, future. They found nobody was telling stories about the future. Nobody was saving for the future. Everybody is renting instead of buying places. So they had this big problem coming down the line. So they were able to try interventions and see the stories move into that space. But the way they look at this is, you can see some patterns in the triads themselves. They call these triads, but you can also take, you can also map combinations of these. So you can measure how far the counter is from one of the corners, and then map that on a much larger diagram. And this one is in 3 dimensions. Okay, so each of these dots is a story, and then the axes are how far away the counter was from something. And these represent patterns in the stories. This is a fitness landscape. So let's say you've decided that that top right corner is better, and you want to move your stories to somewhere better. You can't shift a cluster of people all telling the same story unless there's somewhere for them to move to. So that blue arrow shows a really tightly knit cluster of stories moving to another little cluster. This is the equivalent of me going into an organization and teaching BDD. And I go, okay, well, you have to have conversations between the devs and the testers, right? Now, some organizations, I go in there and they go, well, that's not going to work here. And it's because their culture is an adversarial one. They have an adversarial relationship between the devs and the testers, and I cannot teach the conversations. It's not a good, the constraints are such, they are not going to shift. But it turns out they could do some automated testing. Now, the tests are going to be hard to maintain. They're going to be brittle. They're not going to be in the language of the business. We're not going to be doing BDD with them, but it will give them better quality. And the testers can now get involved in the automated testing. And we're starting to build that bridge. So we're starting to remove some of the constraints which are causing this adversarial relationship. So even though I couldn't move them where I wanted to, because there are no stories in the organization about BDD, there are some stories about automated testing, so we can move them there. This is what we call adjacent possibles. So the way I use fitness landscapes as a concept is I'm always looking out for the adjacent possibles, and they come to me as stories. People telling stories in the organization which are a bit better than the other stories. So when I hear a story about somebody doing something pretty cool, maybe they're doing automated testing when nobody else is, maybe they're doing BDD and having great conversations when nobody else is, it's a sign that that's a plausible direction to move in. So I don't try to necessarily introduce new things as a coach. What I do is I find people who are already doing new things and I amplify their working probes. They are already trying things out. I can see they've got something working and I amplify it. Can I help you do a talk on that? Can we do a lunchtime brown bag? Can we get a poster up? Can you share what you're doing with this group over here? Because I can see they're struggling with it, right? So we're going to spread these ideas and champion changes which are already happening on the ground. I get more movement as a coach from amplifying positives than anything else, from amplifying stuff that is already working. That's how you get through the inertia. If you come in as a coach and you go, you need to do this thing, you are doing it wrong, you'll get backfire effect. And people will tell you why they're not able to do it and what constraints are stopping them. And they will tell you so much that they will start believing in those constraints and reinforcing those constraints. And now it's even harder to get the change you wanted. So whenever you come across that backfire effect, stop pushing, move away, find a different constraint to free up. Try something else, and look out for what other people are already trying, right? Don't ever push change. It doesn't work, which is why things like scaled agile framework rarely work. I was talking to somebody else, someone who'd done that. They said we reorganized everything into squads because people were on multiple projects, and now we want them on focus on one thing, one product line, not split across these multiple projects. So we've reorganized them. They're now all in squads. They're still doing multiple projects, but from within the squads, because they didn't break the relationships with the engineering managers who are coming in and saying, no, you need to work on this. And people don't feel empowered to push back. There's a cultural constraints, right? So this stuff fails because of the disposition of the fitness landscape, the disposition of the organization. So complex spaces have disposition. Things are disposed to work or not, where complicated stuff has predictability. There you go. That's fitness landscapes.
William is asking, what are the labels of how do you determine the labels of the verticals of the triangle?
There's a whole course on SenseMaker, but basically it's are people telling stories that are all about controlling managers? If people are all telling stories about controlling managers and you want there to stop being controlling managers, but when you talk to the managers about servant leadership, I go, I don't want to hear that here. Instead of trying to teach servant leadership, I will go find a manager who is exhibiting servant leadership and I'll start championing them then. Right. So the triads are different depending on what you're trying to do with them. They've got some examples somewhere on the Cognitive Edge website. They've just redone it, so I'm still trying to navigate and find out where everything is there. It's literally been newly posted in the last couple of weeks. But there's all kinds of examples of what the triads say. The thing that you're looking for is what kind of stories are being told in this organization, and can we get people telling different stories by changing some of the constraints.
Liz, what if people in the same team tell different stories? So the product owner tells a different story and the technical lead tells a different story.
Amplify the good ones.
Even in the
really simple. Yeah, whichever one is better, amplify it. The technical, and it might be that they're both good but conflicting.
Yes, that
amplify them both, see which ones wins. You know, it's okay to have a little bit of conflict. So in complexity, there's usually a disagreement about how to move forward. I usually address that with prototypes. You know, let's get something prototyped and then maybe we'll understand the problem better. So a prototype is a probe in software. Yeah. That's a prototype, a spike. I can see George's hand up.
Yeah.
Ardita, in the situation you talk about, I sometimes find that these two stories are from different points of view, and you can move both of them towards a common destination.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting where the team is when you have these two leading.
Yeah, you can get into the human systems dynamics containers differences and exchanges and look at it that way. You'll find that these different stories are coming from different containers. And one thing sometimes I do is try to create a new container that includes both of these. And then they start talking to each other. They start having more exchanges, and the stories start to come to coalesce.
So how would that look, Liz, in the fitness landscape? Is that moving toward, like, was that the blue arrow moving toward a smaller group?
So I don't know George's containers, but it does remind me of constraints mapping. So I know that I've seen some pictures of Dave, and you'll have to check with Dave on this because I'm not certain that this is what he's doing. But I think what he's doing is locating on the map where these constraints exist, which stories are affected by this common constraint. Mm-hmm. So you can actually, with SenseMaker, click on those dots and read the stories. So you could look at the little cluster and go, what's the common thing happening in all these stories? Oh, there's a common constraint there, right? There's a manager who keeps yelling at people, or there's a CAB process they will keep running into, or there's that one legacy system. Mm-hmm. So does that match your idea of a container, George?
Well, it could be, but the way I'm no expert on HSD, but the way I view containers is really sort of anything that groups people. And so there are lots of overlapping containers all the time. Some are stronger than others. For one, I've seen if the programmers sit in one part of the team space and the testers sit in another spot, then they've got two separate containers within that larger container of the team space. And I've seen problems get resolved just by having them mix up and sit differently and not have designated places necessarily. So maybe they move around from time to time. And so there's more exchange between people then because it's not having to cross this container boundary.
Mm-hmm. We have about 3 minutes. Hanan, I saw your hand, but I want to go to something interesting here. Andy from Montreal.
Yeah, I'm reading that too.
Safe into the picture. So how do we feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the only place I've seen Scale Agile really work was AutoTrader. And it was because they were in chaos. So when you're in chaos, you can make large Big Bang changes, and there's more urgency. So urgency gives you more appetite for change. And they had to move very rapidly away from print onto online, to completely sort out their technology. And they did it with a CEO who knew Agile really, really well. It was Trevor Mather, who was ThoughtWorks CEO before he went to AutoTrader, right? So, and even then, I went down there to have a look to see what they were up to. And the board, this board with the tickets on, a physical board, was chaos. It was just nuts. Tickets everywhere. And I said to the developer, how do you know which one is the high priority? And he went, we don't, we guess, right? So even there's still some settling down that has to happen. because it did throw everything into chaos. They literally threw the baby out with the bathwater and hoped to catch it on its way down, right? With an organization where you've got ongoing good stuff happening and you don't want to disrupt the ongoing good stuff, and everybody is still invested in not disrupting the ongoing good stuff, if you impose that restructuring rather than allowing it to gently emerge, what usually happens is that the good stuff keeps going, but now you can't see it. The good stuff which isn't aligned with these other plans. It's still ongoing. There's still some devs somewhere who should be doing this new product development. They've been put in this team, but what they're actually doing is a bit of work during the morning on the product thing, which they talk about in the stand-up, and some other work in the afternoon that they don't talk about and they feel bad about because you haven't managed to break anything. You haven't reorganized the relationships, and the relationships are how things get done in a complex space.
But isn't that why organizations tend to take this idea of like incubators, like take from what's inside out, let it incubate and then bring it back in so they can let the chaos happen. But hey, we still need to make our quarterly profits or whatever the business needs on an ongoing basis. Sort of a different way to look at the three horizons, where the chaos is happening outside, the horizon 3 maybe of things to come or things that can be more creative, but business right now is more inside, but you have to bring it back, right?
Yeah, and the really interesting thing, so Dave Snowden's posted about apex predator theory really recently, the flexuosity thing. He says if you do get to that point where you really want some innovation, you can't get it, and you're about to be overtaken, like by fintech, for instance, overtaking all the big banks, you can create these incubators, but they have to be allowed to compete with your core business. Right. And this is what Kodak didn't do. Kodak didn't go into digital and calls it the Kodak moment. They didn't go into digital because it would have competed with their film business. You have to be allowed to compete. The alternative is to allow this stuff to emerge. So you can have that beautiful safe diagram. I don't think it's beautiful, but never mind. You can have it as coherence. Here is an idea. Okay, and coherence is a realistic reason for thinking that this is a good way forward. But that's all right. Plans are, they're coherence. And then you adapt as things start, and you do it gradually. So find the teams where you can do Agile. Find them when they're about to start on something new and check that the devs have all finished. If they haven't finished, let them finish off that thing, then bring them on board. And yes, people are going to have to learn new skills to get this stuff working, but that was always going to happen. So as you break these teams up and start allowing this stuff to emerge, so you start getting agility, and now you've got some examples, and now the constraints are changing.
But is that the challenge the organizations have from separating out times to employ or to focus in on creative thinking versus going through more of a critical thinking process, like how we're going to make this work, to a strategic thought process that says, okay, this is working, but how do we just optimize what we have? I think a lot of companies, from what I see, try to clump it all together and say, oh, I'm being creative. Now let's just throw that inside, being strategic, but it always doesn't work, right?
Right. Yeah? So I've got a blog post I've been meaning to finish for the last 6 months. The word strategy means leading that which is spread out. That's the etymology of it, from where it comes from. And one of the tendencies people have is to try and centralize everything. So I keep seeing these agile transformations, they're looking at the numbers, they're looking at, the way to create strategy is to look at the relationships and to create better relationships in the organization. And they call that social network stimulation. I'm not an expert on it. It's the one thing I really don't know how to do. They employ all kinds of games to get people talking to each other. But when you build better relationships in the organization, now DevOps happens, not because you told them they had to ship every 2 weeks, but because somebody in development knows somebody in operations and asks how to get something done, and they work together to create that pipeline. And you do it by creating better relationships between people. Dave Snowden reckons, I think you get everybody no more than 2 people away from each other. And you can do that in very large organizations.
I know we are over time, and I know there are still people here, which makes me think that they are still want to hear what's going on and what questions we have to say. I'm okay to stay, and let's keep it a little bit more open, but I don't want to let you go without knowing that next session is going to be, we're going to have Eve as our guest speaker, and I'm going to post the information there on our meetup. And Eve, say hello to the team there, to the group. But yeah, you let me know how to continue. I think people are going because they have probably other meetings, but if someone has a question, please, now is the time.
I got a question. So how would you visualize those clusters so that you can identify those constraints and have some move to some other places?
So you can use SenseMaker. I've seen people do SenseMaker on paper. So the SenseMaker, obviously, you have to pay for. There's a license, there's a patent on the triads. It was reasonable. Like, I paid for an instance for one of my clients, so it was within my affordability. I think it's a bit more expensive these days, or maybe they've made it cheaper because it's stable. I don't know. You'd need to look at the pricing. But yeah, you can get one of those surveys in, or you can do it on paper, and then you can see the clusters for yourselves. You can start seeing the patterns in the triads. The alternative, there's a thing called narrative circles that's on Cognitive Edge's website, which is a method for getting stories out of people. And you can start seeing the patterns in those. They've got some really nice techniques for doing things like you take all of the people in the stories, and then you describe adjectives around them. And then you take the people out and you rearrange the adjectives into what they call archetypes. And the way I always think of this is the archetypes are always overdone versions of what's going on in the organization. So you get the archetype of the really shouty manager. And I always think the way this works is, if I have a bad day and I shout at a team that's used to getting shouted at by the manager, they'll talk a little bit about the fact that I just yelled, and then someone will bring up a story about the shouty manager. So me yelling causes more stories about the shouting manager, not about me shouting, but about the shouting manager, right? So these archetypes emerge in the organization. So when you start seeing the archetypes, you can start seeing how you might, how you might change things as well. Then worth looking at the narrative circles. I think they're a pretty easy thing to run. SenseMaker is hard. I went on a course to learn how to make SenseMaker surveys. It's tricky to get it right, but actually getting SenseMaker in and paying for it, worth doing. I absolutely love SenseMaker, and there's very, very few bits of technology where I'm just like, this blows me away. SenseMaker is just astonishing. And the reports that come out of it, they're very, very good at creating reports that give you an idea of where those patterns are that they can see.
And thanks, Eve, for putting all the links following up there. Well, Liz, this was brilliant. Actually, Sean said utterly brilliant. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for everything you shared with us. And thanks everyone that joined and is still here. I see a lot of people still here. Lovely to have these conversations, and I will post the recording for the ones that will want to go back and listen again. Lots of good things. It feels like one of those movies that I have to see it again to understand the whole story. It was so much and so deep there. Thank you so much.
Cheers. I am going to go, so have a great night all.
Yes.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you,
Love yourself. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.